The art community has made me feel paranoid about stealing for years before AI was a thing. And that's why I was always doomed to hate IP and have no sympathy for the AI steals art argument. I just don't understand other artists who feel that same anxiety and paranoia and not even bat an eye when people use those same principles that hurt them to argue against AI. I guess they're fine being hurt by a system as long as it benefits them too.
This is a complete non-point. Breaking down reference like this is a great way to study. You learn how to more easily break complex objects down into simple shapes, and will also start to develop your own shape language through doing this, as you begin to understand what larger shapes are important to communicate. It will, however, become a crutch if you're just doing this as a way to go from reference to primary sketch. You need to use this as a method of study, not as part of your general practice to go from reference to final piece. That's why it's disincentivized by artists as a part of your method. Children often purity test on art practice because they take everything to extremes. The fact that immature artists will misunderstand why something can be warned against to avoid developing bad habits or crutches and turn it into something bigger is in no way, shape or form related to how damaging generative AI is to the industry or people learning how to paint, draft, etc. Completely unrelated nonsense talking points.
No, I'm not talking about the tracing is bad when it's used as a crutch argument. I'm talking about the tracing is bad because it's plagiarism argument. Can you see how the latter might be related to the AI is bad because it's plagiarism argument? At least try to understand the actual point before dismissing it as unrelated nonsense.
Learn how to read. I'm saying the latter follows on from the former because of immaturity.
Okay, my bad. You're not actually misunderstanding the point. You just think the tracing is bad because the plagiarism argument stems from misinterpreting the tracing is bad when it's used as a crutch argument because something immaturity, rather than a very real psychological experience of outrage and offense seeing someone steal your pose by copying the pose in your art, which is isomorphic to the feeling of outrage and offense people feel seeing someone steal your style by generating an AI image trained off your art.
Because the outrage you're talking about only happens in either children or very immature artists. They know that tracing is bad, but they don't know why, or that it's context sensitive. An AI stealing your whole style and literally digesting your body of work with the intent of imitating and replacing it is a completely different thing. Obviously, you have to be a dribbling pie-faced mungo to conflate the two things.
If you say so. But isn't it funny how people who misinterpret why tracing is bad almost always seem to gravitate towards the particular reason that it's a theft against the artists whose work they're tracing? Anyway, I take it that an AI stealing my whole style and metaphorically digesting my body of work without the intent of imitating and replacing it is totally fine, just like people tracing my drawings.
To be clear, plagiarism through tracing is absolutely a thing, but that isn't what's shown in the image. You see it a lot in comics because of the demands on gesture and form knowledge. A lot of artists seem to find their way into the medium because they were competent at rendering but didn't have the understanding of gesture and form to create compelling images from scratch. Greg Land comes to mind. He's famously dunked on for relying heavily on traced reference images, and a lot of those reference images being porn, which leads to all sorts of poorly fitted facial expressions in his female characters. He's a great example of tracing becoming a crutch, and why it's important to only really trace while studying with intent. Children on Twitter say, "You stole my pose," are not really an issue worth concerning yourself over. If you want to rely on hypotheticals detached from reality, sure, you do you.
Is the issue that it's plagiarism, or is the issue that it's a crutch? Because those are two different issues. Like if the issue is because it's a crutch, then his tracing will not be an offense specifically against the people whose photos he traced, but simply something that hurt the quality of his work. Today I learned that when I use AI image generators without the intent of imitating anyone in particular or replacing anyone at all, I'm a hypothetical person who's not part of reality.
With Land, it's both. It's egregious. What you personally use them for is disconnected from what their place is in our culture. They're intended to replace artists. Any argument against this is bad faith.
Whatever. Trying to get you people to analyze the two separately is like pulling teeth. which is exactly why I suspect they're connected, and not merely a leap by people too immature to know better. Same underlying drive, same continuous spectrum, just mature people have learned to tolerate and forgive the plagiarism on the less severe end of the spectrum, rather than there actually being a point on the spectrum that crosses from plagiarism to non-plagiarism. Intended by who? There are many people involved in the development of AI with a wide range of different intentions. If you define a whole field by the intentions of the people at the top, then restaurants aren't intended to serve people delicious food, they're intended to make money. Education isn't intended to equip kids with the knowledge to thrive in the world, it's intended to train them to be productive, self-policing cogs in society. And the faith of an argument is not based on the contents, it's based on how it responds to existing arguments. If I ignored your claim that AI is intended to replace artists and went, "Nuh-uh, you're wrong," without explaining why, that's bad faith. But any argument against X is bad faith is just a super dogmatic thing to ever say about anything that all but ensures no one can question X.
Why won't you come to the conclusion that fits my perspective? They're different things. Plagiarism also isn't the same thing as arguing that you stole my pose. It's a Sorites paradox, but it's blatantly obvious when something is plagiarism. Well, what do we mean by true? Because it's rather bloody complicated when you get down to it. When you get down to the fundamental brass tacks, we don't really know what anything means.
I don't like to throw around words like straw man or bad faith, but this is literally a straw man. I didn't ask for a conclusion. The rest of your response to this point was perfectly serviceable. And the tooth finally gets pulled out, but not without lots of bleeding. If they are different things, then are there examples of crutch but not plagiarism? Or more importantly, plagiarism but not crutch? I don't see how this is comparable. Among the people involved in developing AI, it could be the case that 60% of them intends to replace artists, and 40% of them intend to enable artists to make an anime on their own without breaking their wrists. What's an example of something that's 60% true and 40% false?
My position hasn't changed. Obviously, the image in the original post could well become a crutch, but that isn't plagiarism. Plagiarism that isn't a crutch is harder to point out because it involves mind reading. They could be plagiarizing because they're lazy or because they need to. Hard to call without honest analysis from a plagiarist. That's somehow much worse. The fact that Sex Panther works every time.
Exactly my point. I wasn't asking for your position to change. I was asking you to engage with the difference between plagiarism and crutch, which you finally are. Okay, thank you. And so my claim, and I hate that I explicitly have to state this, but you do not have to convert or agree with this claim, is that in the example of someone plagiarizing because they're lazy, but they're not using it as a crutch because they can demonstrably do the same thing even without plagiarizing, people will still hate them for plagiarizing. And that has much more in common with hating AI for plagiarizing, and less in common with looking down on someone for using a crutch. If Sex Panther works 60% of the time and does not work 40% of the time, then the statement, Sex Panther works every time, is just false. The negation of for all Y, X works is not for all Y, X doesn't work. It's there exists Y such that X doesn't work.
People don't like people being lazy. The point wasn't that people don't like plagiarism, it's that online artists accusing people doing what was in the original post of plagiarism are conflating the fact that it's warned against by art teachers as part of your method because it can become a crutch. Actual plagiarism is a different thing. No one likes that. It's a joke from a movie. It's called wit.
Or maybe they just actually consider 10 grains of sand a pile, while you don't. What's to say you are more correct than them? This is one of the reasons why the only notion of plagiarism I give a crap about is plagiarism in the sense of academic dishonesty, i.e. deceiving people about who created something or how you created something, even when you created something, hence self-plagiarism being a thing. Honest tracing, honest AI use, honest piracy is all fine in my book. It's useful to have abstractions like pile, even though you run into the Sorites paradox. But when being a pile is morally charged, and there's no clear line from when you cross over to bad thing, just you know it when you see it, this inherently leads to anxiety and paranoia, and it's something most neurotypicals can't seem to understand.
Because there's no reasonable interpretation that makes this plagiarism. We don't structure society around flagrant bad faith and intellectual dishonesty. So much of human interaction is a Sorites paradox because there are no hard boundaries to anything. A sufficiently motivated and rhetorically competent interculator can make the argument that water isn't wet, the sky isn't blue, and that since you're made up mostly of probability clouds, you don't really exist. Even if you could draw a hard line, someone somewhere would have an argument for why it should be pushed in a direction. Laws are a comfortable illusion of certitude and structure. I'm by no means neurotypical. This is just a mealy mouthed excuse to not try to understand the distinction. You can see the obvious difference between the above and what Greg Land does.
I'm sure you have your own neurodivergencies that differ from mine, but you certainly love using words like reasonable, bad faith, excuse, and obvious that pretty much define my core frustrations in interacting with neurotypical society. Not that neurotypical is bad, which you seem to be implying by calling me bringing it up an excuse. I'll give you that you do try to actually explain things sometimes, but the other stuff makes it sufficiently exhausting that this will be my last comment. Of course, you're free to reply to this, to have the last word or set the record straight if I misinterpret something further, but I will not reply. There are hard boundaries to many things. Is X taller or shorter than Y? This has a yes or no answer, even though height is a spectrum and there's no concrete point at which someone is objectively considered tall. And I would love to see someone arguing that the line is somewhere other than where it actually is. How would that even work? Oh, you're actually taller than X if your height is greater than their height minus 1 centimeter? But even then, I explicitly said I don't object to shortcuts such as tall or pile, because most of the time it actually helps us in understanding a shared reality instead of devolving into us calling each other crazy and immature for thinking mauve is purple or teal is green. But no one really gives a crap if someone thinks teal is green when they think it's obviously blue, because green and blue have no value judgments attached to them. It's not like green is good and blue is bad or vice versa. If a sufficiently motivated and rhetorically competent interculator makes the argument that water isn't wet, the sky isn't blue, and since you're made up mostly of probability clouds, you don't really exist, so what? There's no real stakes. They're still saying true things about reality, just in terms of probability clouds instead of approximations like wet, blue, or flesh, which greatly encumbers daily communication with technicalities, but doesn't actually change any prescriptions about how we should live our lives. It doesn't change the fact that touching fire will burn you, even if you replace touch, fire, burn, and you with lengthy technical descriptions. The problem is when a value judgment is attached to pile-like concepts, and again, you haven't actually successfully argued that all concepts are pile-like, since you yourself said your response to my earlier give an example of a statement that's 60% true and 45% false was a joke. It's incredibly hostile to certain people's cognition, and I will reiterate, certain people does not mean all neurodivergent people. I am not invalidating your neurodivergence for not being affected by this. The fact of the matter is, there are real people who think pose studies, or copying color palettes, or copying freaking chord progressions or whatever, is plagiarism. So I'm not crazy to be paranoid about being accused of such when doing it, no matter how much you dismiss it as they're just immature and confused about totally unrelated principle, so their opinions don't matter. Or, okay, I'm statistically unlikely to be accused of such because the people who think that are rare, but what about something in between the post-study tracing in the OP and Greg Land tracing? How should we expect you, or most reasonable people like you, to react to, I don't know, going beyond the pose and also including information on the model's build and musculature in our study. It's just not worth it. All this paranoia and policing just so people's drawings don't get copied. But sure, I can see why people disagree when they don't experience the brunt of the paranoia, while conversely experiencing some other negative emotion when people trace their work that I don't experience when it's done to me.
You don't need to be neurotypical to see something as obvious or reasonable. Understanding human interactions is actually easier if you aren't neurotypical. They follow predictable patterns that most people don't observe, they just act them out subconsciously. Being able to detach yourself from that lets you see the patterns easier. They really aren't. Once you understand that the way we experience and interpret reality is functionally a hallucination that runs on mental constructs that acts like a biological operating software prone to all sorts of faulty interactions. So there's a difference between a fact of the matter and how humans engage with something. Consider this. Tom Hardy and Tom Cruise, one is widely considered an imposing and tall figure, while the other is a short man to the point of being meme-worthy. There's like an inch difference between their reported heights. Tons of things influence how we perceive things. The way people behave, the clothes they wear, their physical presence, how fat or skinny they are, etc. They can all impact how tall we perceive people to be. I'm 5'11", but built like a brick shithouse. Pretty much all of my late teens through my early 20s, people thought I was like 6'2", surprising them when I say my actual height when asked, to the point it became a bit of a joke among my friend group. People actually thought I was the same height as someone in our friend group who actually was 6'2", presumably because of how we carried ourselves, or the fact that I was more well built than him, hard to say. How we perceive and conceptualize things, which is what we're talking about here, not the underlying fact of the matter, there's absolutely no hard boundaries. Just apply the same logic to things like sexual misconduct or assault. There's always going to be an argument over the minutiae of what constitutes what. But we collectively agree things are wrong because it serves the collective to do so. Sometimes being hard to define doesn't mean it's useless to define it. Quite the contrary. And there are legal rules around plagiarism, much like there are ones for sexual misconduct or assault. Just because something doesn't meet the unfortunately always inadequate legal definition, doesn't mean we abandon the social penalty if we can perceive that there was some social transgression. Tough, quite frankly. Again, these are things that have evolved from human interaction. If a person doesn't realize it's inappropriate to touch another person a certain way because of some cognition issue or just poor socialization during childhood, we don't suspend that social contract for them. We may take it into account when considering punition, but the social norm is upheld and they're reprimanded. Same here, just the offense and punition are less severe than my example. Children. Children also think that some little gremlin comes into their room in the night to take their tooth away in exchange for loose change. Children's opinions on these social buggers don't matter. So using a pose for reference is almost never actually lambasted. Same for things like form and lighting. If you're doing the work, then that's what the reference is for. If it's actual tracing, then it does just come off as lazy and doing something that feels wrong, even with the addition of new information. It probably wouldn't be an overt issue without it being so blatant. Part of what makes it blatant is that there's such a huge disconnect between skill level in his work that it becomes jarring and uncanny. That's why he's so lambasted for it. That and the fact that he uses so much porn. Like a woman would be in a scene where she's meant to be in pain and the dude will just trace an O face. It's just fucking weird. You wouldn't apply this to any other bucketed or hole-based norm.
Fuck it. A good night's sleep hasn't evicted this conversation from my head, and you actually didn't accuse me of making excuses or flagrant bad faith in this reply. So against my better judgment, I'm gonna come crawling back. Yes, you can see something as obvious and reasonable, but if it's really part of a pattern you're observing rather than something you're intuiting from vibes, you should be able to give more of an explanation beyond there's no reasonable interpretation, duh. And the pattern I'm seeing is that people's opposition to copying poses by drawing over them rhymes with people's opposition to tracing. It's the same fucking thing, just to different degrees. Have you considered maybe you don't see this because you are not in fact detached from this particular pattern, even if you are detached from many other common ones in society? So here's the problem, right? You say there's an obvious difference between the image in the OP and what Greg Land does. But there's also an obvious difference between that and something that was not drawn over a photo at all. If there's an obvious difference automatically implies that one is plagiarism and the other is not, then why is both the image in the OP and not drawing over a photo at all both objectively not plagiarism? Like with sexual harassment, let's say 0 grains of sand is a purely platonic interaction of, playing chess with the other person while only looking at the chessboard and talking about the chess moves. 10 grains of sand is hitting them on the train. 1,000 grains of sand is literal rape. With plagiarism, let's say 0 grains of sand is drawing without referring to another image at all. 10 grains of sand is copying the pose in an image by roughly sketching over it. And 1,000 grains of sand is tracing every contour. I know if you agree or disagree with this comparison, feel free to suggest a different 10 grains of sand sexual harassment if you disagree. But if I believed in plagiarism in the sense of the copying of another person's ideas, text, or other creative work being a bad thing, I'd say the 0 grains example is not sexual misconduct or plagiarism. The 10 grains is only sort of slightly sexual misconduct or plagiarism, and the 1,000 grains examples is very much sexual misconduct or plagiarism. But it sounds like you're saying that in the plagiarism example, both the 0 grains and the 10 grains example is definitely objectively not plagiarism, while the 1,000 grains example is definitely plagiarism. The image in the OP isn't even only a little bit plagiarism, but it's not a big deal. It's not worth cracking down on because the benefit from the learning people get from doing such exercises vastly outweighs the tiny bit of plagiarism they're doing. It's a categorically different thing. How would you classify the sexual misconduct examples? You're using binary language to describe a spectrum. Plagiarism versus not plagiarism. Children who are categorically ignorant and whose opinions can be discarded versus adults. Like, even with actual sand piles, we can say the sand is starting to pile up. I fully admit I failed catastrophically to communicate this in my previous replies, but my real issue isn't with spectrums, it's pretending that a continuous spectrum is discrete, and also pretending that something that's on the spectrum is actually not on the spectrum at all, and a categorically different thing. And you say,
You wouldn't apply this to any other bucketed or pile-based norm.
but I can say the same for you. Would you classify some other 10 grain equivalent for some other bucketed or pile-based norm as a categorically different thing and not a very, very slight insignificant violation of the norm? By the way, I agree I was wrong about a norm being bucketed or pile-based automatically implies that we must abolish it. But there are other bucketed or pile-based norms which I think it's just not worth it to enforce the heavy cost in mental energy. For instance, whether a work of fiction is using a dark element to add something, or whether it's exploitative trauma porn decided to shock and titillate. I would rather 1,000 writers write gruesome, disgusting murder, rape, torture fics than even one person be afraid to include murder or rape or torture in their story for fear of being exploitative. This is not the certain people's cognition I'm talking about. I'm specifically talking about the anxiety and paranoia, not being unaware of the boundaries and thereby crossing it. I'm talking about the people who are afraid to touch or talk to anyone ever without first giving them a 5-page consent form to sign because it's not clear what is creepy or harassment, and this is the only way to make sure they're not doing that. Yeah, we shouldn't let it slide when someone touches someone else inappropriately because they didn't realize it's inappropriate due to cognition issues. But what would you say to someone who's like, I'm afraid to talk to that person I like because what if I'm being creepy and they feel uncomfortable but are too polite or scared of me to say so, but I don't pick up on it because I suck at reading body language? Would you be like, oh, just talk to them, you're not being creepy as long as you don't touch them without their consent? Only immature children think words can ever constitute sexual abuse. And now you're back to talking about how it's bad from the quality of work perspective. It's lambasted because it looks lazy and weird and wrong and jarring, not because it's a violation of someone's intellectual property rights. I wasn't asking about the former.
Attention! I am now going to say some sexual, controversial, and or disturbing words in order to get this video demonetized. If you're listening to this playing in the background, please pause the video right now if you don't want to hear it. Anal, bang bros, BDSM, blowjob, boobies, coming, cum shot, cunt, dick, dildo, fuck ass, gangbang, genital, grope, ISIS, molest, suicide, poops, rape, shat, shit, slut,